The air was thick, smoke, shouts, horses screaming, steel clashing. Men were running, some fell, others disappeared into a swirl of dust and terror. A trumpet sounded, long, shrill, but no one answered. Silence swallowed it. Something massive moved in the distance, dark shapes advancing faster than anyone expected. The ground trembled under hundreds of boots and hooves. A sudden cheer, then chaos. Orders shouted, confusion grew, yet no one could see the enemy, only shadows. Arrows flew, cutting the air like invisible knives. Screams followed, then silence. Men froze, something was wrong, too wrong. The rhythm of battle, familiar and cruel, had vanished. Signals went unanswered, flags dropped, horses bolted, and still the shapes kept coming. From the ridge a glimmer of steel, a wave of figures moving as one, too many, too fast. A commander shouted, but the words were lost to the wind. The army was surrounded, panic spread like wildfire, friend and foe blurred into the same terror. Voices screamed for help, for retreat, for mercy. The ground shook again, then nothing. A moment passed, the horizon burned with movement, then quiet. No one could explain it. Where had the men gone? Where had the horses vanished? The survivors whispered names, prayed, blamed. But the air held a single, haunting question. Could an army really vanish, without a trace? The year was 1444. Europe's hope rested on a fragile alliance of crusaders. Their goal was clear: stop the expansion of the Ottoman Empire. The city of Varna, perched on the edge of the Balkans, had long been a gateway between East and West. Whoever controlled Varna controlled the balance of power in the region. The Ottoman Sultan Murad II had just returned from a campaign in Anatolia. Reports suggested his forces were vast, over 60,000 men, well-armed, disciplined, and battle-hardened. The Crusaders, numbering barely a fraction of that, were a patchwork of knights, mercenaries, and levies drawn from across Europe. Their banners gleamed in the sun, but beneath the polished armor and proud colors, doubt festered. Rumors spread quickly, whispers of betrayal, of spies in the ranks, of soldiers disappearing during the night. The countryside was tense. Villagers fled the villages closest to the river, leaving the Crusaders' army to camp on open fields where no cover existed. The wind carried an unfamiliar chill, cutting through the layers of chainmail and silk. Birds vanished from the sky. Even the river seemed restless, swelling slightly without warning. The terrain favored no one. Rolling hills offered vantage points but also traps. Forests could hide ambushes. The plains allowed the Ottomans to maneuver with terrifying speed. Every scout reported sightings, yet none could be certain of the enemy's location. The stakes were enormous. This was not a skirmish. Failure here would open the Balkans to conquest. Victory would be celebrated across Christendom. Every soldier understood the consequences. Every commander feared them. Yet for all the planning, something unseen lingered. Something the Crusaders could not name. Strange unease settled over the army like a shadow. No one knew what it was, only that it was growing. Footsteps in the night, whispers along the ridges, eyes glimpsed where none should be. The calm before the storm had a taste of dread. History remembers Varna as a turning point, but at the time, every man could feel the tension tightening like a noose. They were waiting for what they did not know. The horizon held a promise of battle or of something far worse. Among the Crusaders, one group stood out. The Knights of Hungary, led by King W. Ladislaw III, were elite soldiers by reputation. Their mornings began before dawn. Soldiers polished armor until it gleamed. They trained relentlessly with swords, lances, and bows. Discipline was strict. Mistakes were punished swiftly, often with shame, sometimes with more. The knights were warriors forged in fear and duty. Their routines were rigorous: patrols at first light, drills until the sun burned, meals eaten in silence to conserve energy and focus. In camp, they slept lightly, always alert to the faintest sound. Horses were tended as carefully as the men themselves, groomed and fed, trained to respond instantly to commands. Yet even these seasoned warriors carried anxiety. Some prayed incessantly, seeking protection. Others brooded silently, staring at the horizon, wondering when, or if the enemy would arrive. Among them, a few whispered fears of omens, black birds circling, sudden cold winds, the sound of horns in the night that had no source. King W. Ladislaw himself was visible to all, riding among the men. His face was pale, his jaw tight. He had led armies before, but never one so fragmented, so stretched across hostile terrain. He spoke rarely, his voice measured. Yet behind his calm words lay tension. His counselors noticed the way his hand gripped the hilt of his sword, the way he scanned the hills beyond camp, restless. Despite the fear, camaraderie held the men together. They joked quietly in the evening, shared letters from home, sang muted songs to keep spirits alive. Bonds were strong, brothers in arms, but fragile. A single misstep could shatter the chain of command. And in war, fragility could be fatal. The audience is drawn into their world. The clinking of armor, the rhythm of drills, the whispered prayers, the quiet dread. These were not faceless soldiers. They were human beings, layered with courage, doubt, and hope. They believed in the mission. They believed in each other. But no one knew that belief would soon be tested, beyond anything they could imagine. The calm before the storm had a weight. It pressed down on the camp like the sky itself was holding its breath. Men walked through the tents, whispering to one another, trying to break the silence with casual jokes, but even the bravest knights could feel something was off. Scouts returned from the edges of the forest and the distant hills, but their reports made no sense. Nothing at all, one soldier muttered, eyes darting to the horizon. Another claimed he had glimpsed movement, figures moving in unnatural patterns, but when pressed, he could not explain what he saw. Their confusion spread through the camp like wildfire. If even the scouts were unsettled, then something larger, something dangerous was approaching. Horses grew restless. The knight's steeds, usually obedient and stoic, refused to cross certain fields. They neighed and pawed at the ground, their flanks sweating even in the cool morning air. Riders tried to coax them forward, but the animals shied away from invisible forces. Some soldiers laughed nervously, calling it superstition, but unease had already begun to gnaw at the edges of discipline. The weather, too, seemed to conspire against them. Sudden gusts of wind would ripple across the plain without warning, tossing tents and banners. Clouds formed in strange shapes, shadows flickering across the camp as if the hills themselves were alive. Fires sputtered and smoke blew in inconsistent directions. Even seasoned commanders found themselves pausing, scanning the horizon, unsettled by details that should have seemed ordinary. At night the unease deepened. Faint noises came from the ridges, a soft drum, a whistle, or perhaps just the wind, but soldiers swore they could hear voices speaking in a language unknown to them. Shadows moved between trees and tents, always just out of clear sight. Men reported glimpses of riders appearing on distant ridges, only to vanish when anyone approached. Messengers went missing for hours, returning dazed and incoherent. Some refused to speak of what they saw, shaking their heads as if recalling the memory would summon the unknown force again. Even simple tasks became perilous. Supply wagons were found overturned with no sign of struggle. Armor and weapons were discovered abandoned on empty roads. Horses had wandered from their stables, tracks leading nowhere. Knights whispered that the plain itself seemed to resist them, as if the land conspired to sow confusion and fear. Among the officers, there were debates. Some insisted it was just nerves, the natural tension before a battle. Others suggested scouts were exaggerating. But a quiet, creeping dread permeated every corner of the camp. Soldiers could feel it in the way their stomachs knotted when they woke at dawn. They felt it in the silence of fields where birds no longer sang. They felt it in the strange alignment of the wind, the flicker of shadows, and the way campfires seemed to burn unevenly, sending dancing, threatening shapes across the ground. King W. Ladislaw himself noticed it. He rode through the camp during the late afternoon, glancing at his soldiers' faces, seeing tension and fear in eyes that should have been steady with courage. He scanned the horizon repeatedly, expecting to see the Ottoman advance, yet there was only an unsettling stillness. And still, scouts returned with tailies of movement and flickering lights in places where no enemy should have been. As the sun set, the ordinary noises of the camp, clanging armor, hammering low conversations, began to feel wrong. Footsteps echoed too loudly, tents rustled with no wind, and whispers carried across empty space. Men huddled closer to fires, glancing nervously at shadows cast by the flickering flames. Sleep was uneasy. The wind carried voices and sometimes the faint scent of smoke or iron without source. It was as if the battlefield itself was preparing them, not for a fight but for something far stranger, something they could not name, something unstoppable. And so the army waited, tense, alert, vulnerable. Every soldier sensed the storm approaching, but no one knew its shape, no one knew its strength. The warning signs were all there. They had only to notice them, only to heed them. But fear and discipline are fragile companions, and in a few hours both would be tested beyond anything imaginable. It began almost imperceptibly. A flicker on the horizon, a glint of steel in the afternoon sun. At first, some men dismissed it. Scouts thought it might be a small Ottoman patrol, but the glimmer grew, stretching across the hills, moving faster than anyone expected. A sudden gust of wind swept through the camp, tossing banners and raising dust. Horses whinnied, pawing at the ground. The first alarm was shouted, though no one knew precisely why. It was instinct, the sense that something massive, something relentless was arriving. Then the sound came, low at first, almost like distant thunder, rolling, continuous, vibrating through the earth. The men froze, they glanced at one another. Whispers passed through the ranks. "It's them, no, it can't be." And then it exploded into chaos. Arrows rained, not in neat volleys but erratically, cutting through the air in every direction. Soldiers raised shields, swords, anything they could. Horses bolted, dragging knights into the dust. Commands shouted by officers were swallowed by the roar of the unknown. Figures appeared everywhere. From ridges, from forests, from the plain itself, men could see movement at impossible speeds. Shadows passed over soldiers' heads, strikes came from directions that should have been safe. The battle rhythm, the familiar cadence of charge, counter, defense, was gone. Everything was wrong. Knights tried to form ranks to stand their ground, but cohesion failed immediately. The first regiment, elite and disciplined, was scattered in moments. Horses reared, screaming. Riders fell, tangled in reins and bodies. A squadron attempting to flank vanished into dust clouds before anyone could react. The king's voice was heard once, shouting orders. Then silence. Soldiers who tried to reach him found only emptiness. His standard remained standing, the royal banner fluttering in the wind, but the king himself gone. Panic spread. Men ran in every direction, tripping over each other in the confusion. Time seemed to fracture. Seconds stretched, then collapsed. Moments were unrecognizable. Screams echoed but were quickly swallowed by the thunderous movement surrounding the army. Dust, smoke, and the roar of countless hooves and voices created a visual fog, hiding friend from foe. Some soldiers attempted to regroup near their banners, only to find the unit beside them gone. Where a squad had stood, there was nothing but empty ground. From every ridge, every tree line, new figures appeared. It was impossible to track. Attackers struck in perfect coordination, yet there were too many, too fast, and they seemed to vanish as quickly as they appeared. Soldiers swore the enemy appeared almost as if by magic, figures emerging from the plains themselves. The sound was deafening, clanging of armor, shouts, neighing, arrows cutting air, and then abruptly silence. A hush descended that was almost physical. Horses froze mid-step. Men stumbled, looking around. Some screamed, but the words seemed to vanish into the empty air. The field was no longer crowded with battle, it was empty. Entire regiments had vanished. The ground bore the traces of chaos, trampled grass, scattered armor, broken lances, but the men themselves were gone. Nothing explained the disappearance. No retreating lines, no bodies, no prisoners. Only emptiness. Survivors, those who had been on the periphery or late to engage, staggered across the plain. They called for comrades. No one answered. They searched for the king. Only the royal banner remained. They ran, shouting into the wind, but the vast numbers of vanished soldiers left no path, no trail. Even nature seemed altered. Birds did not circle overhead. The sun, sinking in the west, cast long shadows across empty fields. Dust swirled in the late afternoon light, masking what little remained. A quiet settled over the battlefield, oppressive and unnatural, as if the earth itself had swallowed the army. Some tried to count bodies, only to realize there were almost none. Only fragments, a helmet, a sword, a shattered shield. No sign of cavalry charges, no signs of retreat, no bodies or blood. The field was a tableau of absence, of sudden disappearance. No one could explain what they had witnessed. The men whispered among themselves, disbelief etched into their faces. Could an entire army vanish in moments? Could 60,000 trained soldiers simply disappear without a trace? Questions arose that had no answers. Where had the king gone? Where had the elite regiments gone? Had they been annihilated, captured, or taken by something else entirely? The survivors dared not speak of it openly for fear of being dismissed, or worse, accused of cowardice. The battlefield remained empty as night approached. Fires that had marked the positions of camps now burned alone. Shadows stretched unnaturally across the plain, and the wind whispered through the abandoned banners. Silence ruled, not the silence of the defeated, not the silence of mourning, a silence that carried a single, terrifying message. The army was gone, and no one would ever know where. Dawn broke over Varna, and the battlefield was still empty. The first light revealed only a plain scarred with trampled grass, abandoned weapons, and the occasional overturned wagon. But no bodies, no lines of retreat, no sign of the army that had stood there the day before. The silence was unnatural, pressing, almost unbearable. Commanders scrambled. Scouts were dispatched in every direction, riding into forests, over hills, along riverbanks. Messengers were sent to nearby villages, demanding information from anyone who had seen movement the night before. But what they returned with only deepened the mystery. Villagers claimed they had seen nothing. No armies, no battle cries, no fires. Some whispered of strange lights in the distance, shadows moving against the terrain, or figures appearing and disappearing like ghosts. Search parties combed the battlefield itself. Soldiers lifted helmets, checked under carts, and tramped over every inch of the plain. Some found fragments of shields or bits of armor, but always scattered, disconnected, meaningless. No bodies were ever found. No prisoners. No horses. Only the faint, lingering smell of sweat and smoke carried on the morning breeze. Reports from the surviving scouts and officers were contradictory. One group swore the army had been cut down in a coordinated strike, scattered across multiple points of attack. Another claimed the soldiers had vanished suddenly, as if swallowed by the earth itself. Maps were examined. Dispatches were read. Every page seemed to offer a different version. Even the Sultan's chroniclers later reported confusion. Their own spies had been unable to track the Crusaders' movements during the critical hours. Interrogations of captured scouts or stragglers yielded little clarity. Some men were too traumatized to speak. Others gave accounts that did not match any known troop movements or strategies. Witnesses described fleeting glimpses of columns disappearing into dust clouds, of soldiers moving in ways that defied explanation, of horses bolting without riders. Official scribes tried to record these testimonies, but their notes were fragmentary, redacted, and often left unresolved. High-ranking commanders grew frustrated. Messages were sent to neighboring kingdoms, requesting aid and intelligence. Some letters never arrived, some returned unsigned. It was as if the army had vanished from maps as well as from the field. The remaining officers convened in tense meetings, debating whether to report total destruction, partial loss, or the impossibility of the situation. Every report seemed to contradict another. Meanwhile, rumors circulated among the surviving troops. Some whispered that certain scouts had been silenced, their memories deliberately erased, or perhaps they themselves disappeared when the battlefield was empty. Others suggested that orders had been deliberately falsified to cover up something so extraordinary it could not be acknowledged. Soldiers speculated quietly, trading theories in low voices, fearful of being dismissed as superstitious or cowardly. Even the Sultan's court reported confusion. Dispatches noted missing details in every report. Some chronicles were erased, rewritten, or classified for decades. Names of witnesses vanished. Events were summarized briefly, often with phrases like unknown circumstances, or the army was defeated decisively, leaving enormous gaps in the record. Search efforts eventually slowed. Commanders could do little but survey the empty battlefield, catalog what few remnants remained, and await the return of soldiers who had vanished, or so they hoped. The survivors themselves were traumatized, haunted by what they had seen or failed to see. Many refused to speak at all, leaving only the most cryptic notes in official logs. And yet, even after weeks of investigation, nothing explained the disappearance. The field remained a silent witness to the unknown. The mystery was preserved not only by the emptiness of the plain, but by the contradictory records, redacted documents, and frightened whispers of survivors. No army had ever vanished so completely, leaving behind almost nothing but questions. History remembers Varna as a decisive Ottoman victory, but the true events, the disappearance of entire regiments, the vanishing of men and horses, remain unresolved. The search concluded with official reports of defeat, but the gaps, contradictions, and missing testimonies continue to provoke speculation. Something had happened there, something extraordinary, but no one could prove what it was. The unanswered questions hung in the air like smoke. Had the army been annihilated? Had they fled? Or had something else, something beyond explanation, claimed them that day?
For centuries, historians have puzzled over Varna. How could an army of 60,000 men, elite, disciplined, and battle-hardened, disappear almost entirely from the battlefield? What follows are the most persistent theories, each raising as many questions as it attempts to answer. The first explanation is conventional. The Crusaders were outmaneuvered, encircled, and destroyed. The Ottomans were experts at battlefield strategy, and their numerical advantage was overwhelming. To some, this is the simplest answer. The army collapsed under superior force. Yet contradictions arise. Official reports and survivor testimonies describe entire regiments vanishing, without a trace, leaving no bodies, no captives, no orderly retreat. The scale of disappearance seems impossible, even for a catastrophic defeat. How could such a meticulously organized army evaporate overnight, leaving almost nothing behind? The numbers alone challenge conventional logic. Another theory points to betrayal from within. Perhaps some commanders switched sides or deliberately mismanaged the battle. This would explain sudden disarray and the collapse of cohesion at critical moments. Some surviving officers hinted at treachery, whispering of orders that were ignored, messages delayed, and strategic positions abandoned. But evidence is scarce. Many records that might have documented treachery were erased, redacted, or classified. Witnesses who survived often refused to speak, whether from fear, shame, or trauma. Betrayal could have occurred, yes, but if it did, it remains invisible, leaving only a chilling sense that something deeper, hidden, was at play. Some suggest that natural forces intervened. Sudden storms, floods, or even seismic activity could have scattered the army, creating confusion and disorientation. Reports from the period do not confirm catastrophic weather events, yet vague references to unusual winds, dust clouds, and flickering light fueled speculation. Critics argue that no known phenomenon could account for the near-total disappearance of soldiers, horses, and entire regiments. Fields remained largely intact. Terrain showed little evidence of a disaster large enough to erase an army. Still, natural forces remain a theory enigmatic and unsatisfying, leaving viewers to wonder if something inexplicable shaped the events. Finally, there is the most mysterious theory, that unseen forces, be they Ottoman secret units, mercenaries, or other clandestine actors, played a decisive role. Some Ottoman records hint at special operations or maneuvers, deliberately classified and rarely documented. Witnesses spoke of strange lights, unusual movement, and figures appearing where none should have been. Could a small, highly trained contingent have caused panic on such an unprecedented scale? The evidence is circumstantial. Most documents have been lost, classified, or destroyed. Eyewitness accounts conflict. Historians can only speculate, adding to the haunting allure of Varna. Each theory contains its own contradictions. Military failure cannot explain total disappearance. Betrayal is impossible to prove. Natural disaster seems implausible, yet cannot be fully dismissed. Secret interventions are mysterious, yet tantalizingly possible. And so the truth remains locked away. Some files are classified, some records erased, some witnesses were silenced, disappeared, or simply never recorded. What we know is fragmented, contradictory, and incomplete. What happened at Varna defies easy explanation. Some call it history, others a mystery, and a few even whisper of forces beyond human comprehension. Every year, every historian, every curious mind returns to the same questions. What truly occurred? How did an army vanish almost entirely? And why has the record been obscured, leaving only shadows, whispers, and speculation? For viewers, the challenge is simple. Consider the possibilities, weigh the evidence, and ask the questions the historians cannot answer. Because at Varna, the line between fact and enigma is blurred, and the truth may never be known. The sun sets over Varna, casting long shadows across a plain that will never reveal its secrets. History records a decisive Ottoman victory. But the truth, the events that erased an army of 60,000 from the field, remains obscured, fragmented, and almost impossible to reconstruct. Why did so few survive? Why do conflicting reports and missing records dominate the chronicles? Why were so many witnesses silenced, files erased, or testimonies left deliberately vague? The answers, if they exist, are locked behind centuries of uncertainty and human fear. Some truths are buried not because they cannot be understood, but because someone decided they must remain hidden. The silence of the battlefield is haunting. Not the silence of death alone, but the silence of disappearance, of questions that have no answer. The army vanished, leaving only dust, broken armor, scattered banners, and the whisper of what might have been. The ordinary sounds of life, the footsteps of soldiers, the neighing of horses, the clash of steel, were replaced by a void that history cannot fill. And so, the final question lingers, more chilling than any description of battle or strategy. What really happened on that day at Varna, and who, or what, ensured that no one would ever know? We may never uncover the full truth, but in the silence of the plains, in the gaps of the chronicles, and in the shadows of erased memories, the mystery waits. Perhaps the answers lie in forgotten archives, classified files, or the whispers of the few who survived. Or perhaps they will remain forever beyond reach, a shadow etched into history. If you have a theory, if you see a pattern that history overlooks, share it. Because Varna does not only belong to the past, it belongs to those who dare to question it.